Three numbers open this story like a receipt: 711, 722, and too cheap to matter. In 711, Iberia doesn't fall with the slow dignity of a siege. It collapses with the speed of a system already hollowed out. By 722, the Umayyad machine has learned the worst habit a winning power can learn. It confuses momentum with permanence. It starts treating resistance as a rounding error, something winter, hunger, and geography will erase for free. So here is the big question. We'll keep alive until the end. When power feels total, what actually defeats it? Enemy strength, or the empire's addiction to contempt and low-cost control? Chronicles can brag. Later legends can pray. But logistics, fear, and terrain keep the real ledger. If you value the record over the romance, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. Picture the Umayyad commander receiving a report from the far north of Iberia. Not a rival kingdom, not a disciplined army. A pocket of rebels in Asturias, wet mountains, narrow passes, fog that turns distance into deception. Scouts say they are starving, surviving on scraps, honey, whatever the rock and forest will surrender. And the reaction isn't alarm, it's laughter. The empire has just watched cities fold. It has watched elites bargain. It has watched gates open. After that kind of speed, a cave looks like a joke. And this is where the script's most revealing detail isn't the cave, it's the insult. Wild donkeys. Whether the phrase comes from later retellings or not, it captures a historical truth about conquest. Domination begins when the victor stops seeing the defeated as political actors and starts seeing them as animals. Because once people are animals, you don't need negotiations. You don't need mercy. You don't even need strategy. You just need a broom. That contempt is not just cruelty. It's an economic calculation disguised as arrogance. Marching an army into Asturias costs food, time, broken horses, supply headaches, men lost to cold and sickness. Why spend a budget on a nuisance that looks like it will die on its own? Empires do this constantly. They outsource violence to the environment, then call the outcome inevitable. They let hunger do the killing. They let winter do the policing. They let geography do the execution, so their hands can stay clean in the paperwork. But contempt creates a blind spot. If you only count bodies, 300 men is a punchline. If you count composition, survivors, veterans, dispossessed nobles, men with nothing left to bargain with, then 300 is not small. It's concentrated. It's hardened. It's a seed that can survive in conditions where normal armies rot. And in the middle of that seed is a man the new regime tried to domesticate. Pelayo. Before the mythology turns him into a saint in armor, treat him as what he first was, a political problem. A surviving figure with a name, a lineage, and the dangerous ability to become either a collaborator or a symbol. You keep someone like that close. You offer a gilded cage. You make the cost of rebellion feel irrational. But irrational is exactly what humiliation produces. The empire's consolidation isn't only taxes and garrisons, it's the quiet theft of dignity. Hostage-taking, forced loyalty, strategic marriages, the message that your old world is over and your only future is obedience. A cave in Asturias becomes more than a hiding place. It becomes a refusal to accept the new definition of reality. That's why Covadonga matters before a single arrow flies. Because the battle, whatever its real numbers, begins earlier, inside the Empire's mind, when it decides some lives are too small to count. In the next part, we go back to the moment Iberia's old order cracked, and we ask the question that makes every conquest possible. Who opened the gates, and what did they get paid for it? If you want to understand why a cave in Asturias could matter at all, you have to stop treating 711 like a clean invasion story. Conquest doesn't begin when a foreign army arrives. It begins when a state's own elites learn, through years of succession crises and court violence, that the crown is not sacred. It's negotiable. And once power becomes negotiable, the country becomes tradable. Late Visigothic Hispania was not a stable machine waiting to be crushed. It was a kingdom that had trained its ruling class to behave like rival gangs in a palace. Kings did not always pass peacefully from father to son. Factions competed, nobles rose and fell, and every transfer of power taught the same lesson. Loyalty is a currency, not a virtue. That matters more than any romantic tale about destiny, because when the moment of external pressure arrives, the first instinct is not defend the realm. The first instinct is, who can I use this crisis to destroy? That's the ugly background noise under the famous name Guadalete. Even if the details blur in the sources, the effect in memory is consistent. Roderick is defeated, the center collapses, and the speed of the Umayyad advance becomes the story. But speed is not a miracle. Speed is what happens when the defender has no unified command, no trusted chain of obedience, and no shared belief that the state is worth dying for. A functioning kingdom can lose battles and still survive. It reroutes power. It appoints new commanders. It fortifies. It taxes. It bleeds. But it coordinates. A hollowed kingdom does something else. It shatters into private survival strategies. Cities weigh the cost of resistance against the promise of a negotiated surrender. Local elites ask the question that sounds pragmatic and is actually fatal. If we can keep our estates, why die for a king we hated yesterday? This is where the empire's victory becomes less about superior swords and more about administrative psychology. The conquerors did not need to exterminate everyone to win. In fact, extermination is inefficient. Ash pays no taxes. A dead countryside feeds no garrisons. So after the initial shock, power changes its shape. It stops being a wave of raiders and starts becoming a bureaucracy with a sword. That transformation is the part heroic national mythologies love to minimize, because it's not cinematic. It's paperwork, it's oaths, it's negotiated continuity. The new rulers keep roads, keep cities, keep productive land, keep the people who know how to collect rents, then attach them to a new political center. This is the quiet genius of empire. It turns yesterday's enemy into tomorrow's manager and calls it peace. And the moral cost is immediate, because the price of collaboration is not only tribute, it's a public lesson. The world is now rearranged, and those who submit early get to live comfortably inside the rearrangement. Those who hesitate get crushed to teach everyone else what reality means. That's why the gates opened image matters. It doesn't mean the population threw flowers. It means the system of fear and incentives did its work. Some communities were exhausted. Some hated the Visigothic tax burden. Some were trapped between rival elites and simply wanted the fighting to stop. And yes, certain groups persecuted under the old regime could plausibly see the change in power as relief, at least in the short term. But the broader point is colder than any one community's reaction. A kingdom falls fastest when its people no longer believe the old rulers are worth defending, and its elites believe they can bargain their way out. Now put Pelayo back into this landscape, not as a legend yet, but as a problem. A surviving figure with a name is valuable to any occupying regime. You can kill him and create a martyr, or you can keep him alive and try to convert him into proof that the new order is legitimate. That's why hostage politics appears so often in conquest stories. Hostages are insurance policies. They are living receipts. They tell the conquered, "Your bloodline is in our hands. Behave." So imagine the first years after 711 not as a continuous slaughter, but as a series of deals enforced by the threat of slaughter. The conquerors consolidate. They assign governors. They measure land. They organize tribute. They make examples when necessary. And they rely on intermediaries, the local men who know the roads, the families, the grain stores, to keep the machine running. These intermediaries are not footnotes. They are the real hinges of empire. Which means the true battlefield isn't only Guadalete. It's the moment a noble chooses to defect, the moment a bishop chooses to counsel submission, the moment a city council decides the cost of resistance is too high. The moment a rival faction decides letting the enemy in is a convenient way to purge domestic opponents. Call it treason, call it pragmatism. Either way, it is the same act. Trading the public's future for private survival. And once enough of those acts happen, conquest looks effortless. The invaders begin to believe their own propaganda, that God, fate, or history itself is on their side, that nothing can stop them, that a wet corner of mountains in the north is not even a war, it's an afterthought. But here's the pivot that sets up Covadonga. Empires don't lose because they face resistance. They lose because they misprice it. They treat a small pocket of defiance as cheaper to ignore than to crush. They assume hunger will finish the work, and they don't notice what hunger is doing to the people they've cornered, turning them into men who no longer have anything to negotiate with. So before we go back to caves and ambushes, answer this. When Iberia collapsed, who got to keep their wealth by calling surrender realism? And who paid for that realism with their bodies? Because in the next part, we're not looking at a battlefield. We're looking at the apparatus that makes conquest stick. Hostages, forced legitimacy, and the humiliation that manufactures rebellion. Conquest is often sold to you as a single violent moment, a battle, a banner raised, a king dead. That's propaganda, simple enough to remember, clean enough to justify. Real conquest is uglier because it is patient. It doesn't only destroy, it reorganizes. It takes the defeated and turns them into tools, then tells them they should be grateful for the privilege. After the first shock of 711, the Umayyad project in Iberia shifts from blitz to management. Not because the conquerors suddenly become merciful, but because management is how you profit. You can raid a region once, burn it, and move on. Or you can keep it producing grain, rents, labor, and taxes for decades. The second option is always more attractive to an empire that thinks in ledgers. So the violence evolves into something more refined, the violence of permanence. And permanence requires intermediaries. The new rulers don't have enough men to micromanage every valley and town. They need local elites, bishops, nobles, administrators, to do what elites always do: keep people obedient, keep payments flowing, keep trouble small. This is where collaboration stops being a moral word and becomes a job description. The collaborators don't have to love the conquerors. They only have to adopt the new arithmetic. Submit and keep your estate. Resist and lose everything. How do you make that arithmetic feel irresistible? You take hostages. Hostages are not merely prisoners. They are the empire's language translated into flesh. When you hold a noble's son, you don't just control that one body, you control an entire network of loyalties. The hostage becomes a warning to every family that still has property to lose. You can keep your title, the empire implies, as long as your blood remains within reach. This is how a regime buys silence, without deploying armies to every village. It's cheaper than constant war, it's cleaner than mass slaughter, and it is psychologically devastating because it forces the defeated to participate in their own containment. Now, place Pelayo inside this mechanism. Whether every detail of his early biography is recoverable or not, the political logic is obvious. A surviving Visigothic figure with status is either dangerous or useful. Kill him and you risk making a symbol. Keep him close and you can attempt something more elegant. Domestication. The gilded cage. The message. You can live. You can even serve. You can even keep a name. If you accept that your world is over. This is the part where power gets intimate. Not in romance, in ownership, because conquest doesn't stop at borders. It enters families. It reassigns marriage, lineage, and legitimacy. And that's why the script's marriage politics theme, whether it happened exactly as later tradition frames it, matters as an analytical lens, even beyond its factual uncertainty. Empires repeatedly use marriage as a tool, because marriage is not only a private bond, it is a public claim. It is a way to launder conquest into continuity. If a regional governor marries into an old royal bloodline, the occupation starts to look like a merger, a partnership, a new normal. The conquered are told, "Your leaders have joined us, therefore your resistance is irrational." This is how violence becomes socially acceptable. It is rewritten as administration, but that rewriting is also a provocation. Because to the conquered, symbolic seizures can feel worse than taxes. Taxes hurt the stomach, symbolic seizures hurt the identity. A man can pay money and still pretend he is himself. But when power reaches into your family, when it claims your sister, your inheritance, your bloodline, it isn't only taking resources, it's taking the last remaining proof that your past mattered. That is the psychological fuse the empire often misreads. Conquerors understand the economics of food and tribute. They frequently underestimate the economics of humiliation. Humiliation is not a side effect. It is a policy tool. It teaches everyone watching that your old status means nothing, that your honor is permission-based, that your dignity is now rented from the new regime. And people do not all respond the same way. Most adapt. They learn the new language. They choose survival. They become the reasonable voices who tell others to be practical. They become the men who stand on the safe side of history and call their fear wisdom. But a minority responds differently. They stop negotiating. This is where a hostage becomes a rebel. Not because he suddenly becomes brave, but because his incentives invert. The domestication offer works only if the captive still believes there is a future inside obedience. Take that belief away through public insult, forced symbolic submission, a final act of erasure, and you create someone who no longer values the safety you're selling. And once someone no longer values what you can offer, they become ungovernable. The North becomes the laboratory for this transformation because the geography offers something politics cannot, a place the empire can't easily administer. In the lowlands, conquest is a spreadsheet: roads, cavalry, grain, garrisons. In Asturias, conquest is a wound that never closes. Mountains fracture the map, valleys isolate command, fog erases distance, horses become liabilities, supply lines become prayers. So the empire does what empires do at margins. It postpones. It leaves a pocket of resistance to starve, to freeze, to dissolve. It decides that spending real resources on a handful of fugitives is inefficient. It laughs. It calls them animals. It waits for winter to do its work. And that is the mistake that turns humiliation into a weapon against the humiliator. Because while the empire is calculating taxes and planning new campaigns, the North is doing something slower but deadlier. It is turning refugees into a unit, bitterness into discipline, and terrain into a machine. Here's the question that carries us into the next part. What happens when an empire's cost-benefit logic meets a landscape where the costs can't be calculated, because the landscape itself is the enemy's ally? In other words, when the empire finally decides to solve Asturias, will it be marching into a rebellion or into a trap built out of contempt? An empire at full sprint is drunk on its own logistics. That's the part most people miss when they talk about conquest like it's a moral fable. The winners aren't only confident, they're chemically addicted to momentum. Every city that falls quickly becomes proof that the next city will fall even faster. Every deal signed without resistance becomes evidence that resistance is obsolete. Speed stops being a tactic and becomes a theology. The Umayyad expansion in the early 8th century is built on that high. The machine moves because it has learned a set of assumptions that keep it light. The enemy will fracture. The local elite will bargain. The countryside will feed you. And your cavalry advantage will decide anything that tries to stand in the open. When these assumptions hold, your army doesn't feel like an army. It feels like gravity, inevitable, impersonal, and therefore justified. But gravity only works in open space. In Asturias, there is no open space. There are only costs. Here is the empire's problem in its simplest form. To finish the North, you don't just need troops. You need a supply philosophy. You need to move men through narrow passes where they can't forage easily, where carts struggle, where horses injure themselves, where weather eats time like fire eats paper. Time becomes the enemy, and time is expensive. This is the part of conquest nobody puts in statues: the budget. Not a modern budget, but the ancient one. Grain, fodder, replacement animals, medical care, pay, and the opportunity cost of sending soldiers into a region that offers little loot and less glory. Even if you win, what do you win? Wet rock, scattered villages, a coastline that is hard to tax, a terrain that punishes garrisons. Occupation isn't a victory parade, it's a monthly invoice. So the empire does what efficient powers do. It prioritizes. It allocates force toward regions where force converts into revenue. It keeps pressure on the plains and the cities, where roads allow movement and where the administrative spine can be built. Governors, tribute, legal authority, predictable extraction. The North, by contrast, is the kind of place that turns soldiers into sick men and victories into exhaustion. It's a bad investment. That's the real meaning behind the contempt. Wild donkeys is not only an insult, it's a category in a mental spreadsheet, low-value resistance, not worth the cost of attention. And attention is always the rarest resource in a successful conquest. The more territory you seize, the more borders you create. The more cities you inherit, the more you must police. The more deals you sign, the more you must enforce. Success multiplies obligations. This is why empires often lose their sharpness right after they feel invincible. They become managers of their own expansion, and managers are tempted to believe paperwork is the same thing as control. So the North is delayed, not because the conquerors cannot win, but because winning there would feel like overpaying. And every month the North is delayed, something happens that the empire's spreadsheet doesn't measure. A pocket of resistance stops being an accident and starts becoming a structure. This is where Pelayo matters again. Not as a saint, not as a nationalist icon, but as an organizer formed inside the empire's own system. If you keep a surviving noble alive as a hostage, you are attempting to purchase his future loyalty. But captivity also educates. It teaches the captive how the new regime thinks, where it is strong, where it is lazy, where it delegates power, where it relies on collaborators, where it assumes compliance. A hostage doesn't only suffer, he learns the occupier's habits, and habits are exploitable. Meanwhile, in the mountains, survival itself becomes military training. Hunger hardens people, but it also simplifies them. A man starving in fog does not have time for complicated politics. He learns one lesson: the empire cannot be met on its terms. The empire wins on open plains, with cavalry, with mass, with predictable battles. So, you remove the battlefield. You deny the cavalry, you deny the mass. You create conditions where the empire's strengths cannot be applied without turning into liabilities. And notice what the empire is doing at the exact same time. It's thinking about France. It's thinking about the next campaign, the next frontier, the next expansion that will pay back the investment in glory and revenue. This is not incompetence. It's rational, imperial behavior. But rational behavior can still be fatal when it's built on an assumption that the marginal problem will remain marginal. That assumption is the empire's blind spot. It believes weakness stays weak. It believes a small rebellion is naturally small, as if resistance is a fixed quantity rather than a process. It believes starvation and winter will dissolve the problem on their own. But starvation can also radicalize. Winter can also select. The men who remain after years of cold aren't normal. They are the ones who can tolerate suffering without surrendering. That's what empires forget when they outsource violence to the environment. Environments don't only kill, they also forge. And once forged, the North begins to look less like a pocket and more like a trap. Not because it suddenly has a massive army, but because it has something more valuable: asymmetry. It has local knowledge, mobility on foot, hiding places, supply caches, scouts who know which ridges see which valleys. It has time to learn terrain the way a court learns gossip. Time to turn a gorge into a funnel and a cave into a gate. An imperial commander arriving later, with orders to deal with it, is walking into a situation the empire itself created. A rebellion strengthened by neglect. And neglect is always framed as wisdom, until the day it becomes a grave. So when the expedition finally comes, when the empire decides it's time to cash in this annoying invoice, what kind of force will it send? A disciplined campaign built for mountains? Or the laziest possible solution? A show of overwhelming numbers meant to intimidate, not to understand. Because that is the final seduction of empire. When you have scale, you start believing scale is a substitute for thought. In the next part, we follow Pelayo, not as a myth, but as a product of imperial policy, an elite the new regime tried to tame, and a human being humiliation turned into a weapon. And we ask the question the conquerors never ask until it's too late. What happens when the peoples you tried to manage stop wanting a future inside your empire? Because your peace has become a form of slow execution. Power loves a certain kind of defeated man, not the one who dies shouting. That's inconvenient. Martyrs are loud. They echo. Power prefers the survivor with a title, the noble who can be turned into proof that the new order is reasonable. Keep him alive, feed him just enough, dress him in courtesy, and he becomes a living advertisement. Look, even their leaders accept us. That is the logic behind hostages and gilded cages. And that is the logic that makes Pelayo, whatever the exact details of his early life, such a threatening figure. Not because he is magically brave, but because he sits at the intersection of two currencies empires crave: legitimacy and compliance. In the heroic version, Pelayo is born a rebel, already standing in mist with a sword and a prophecy. In the version empires actually face, he begins as something far more ordinary and far more dangerous. An elite with a memory. A man who has watched the old order collapse and therefore understands how quickly inevitable regimes can become ruins. He has seen loyalty fail. He has seen a king vanish. He has seen power move from one set of hands to another like property. That experience does not automatically produce resistance. Often it produces cynicism. It produces collaboration. It produces the belief that survival requires bending, which is exactly why the conquerors try to bend him first. A hostage system is not only about chains, it's about psychology. You are placed close enough to power to taste safety, but not close enough to forget who controls it. You are allowed to live, but you live as a condition. You are allowed to keep your name, but your name is now rented. The message is constant and perfectly rational. Adapt, participate. There is no going back. That message works on most people. It's not because they are weak, it's because they are human. The body wants food. The mind wants predictability. Most people will trade the abstract idea of dignity for the concrete reality of not starving. But the hostage strategy has a flaw that empires consistently underestimate. Captivity also teaches. When you are trapped inside a regime, you learn its rhythm. You learn which officials are arrogant, which are lazy, which are corruptible. You learn what the regime fears and what it dismisses. You learn what paperwork matters and what paperwork is theatre. You learn how it delegates violence, how it makes local intermediaries do the dirty work, so the center can pretend its hands are clean. This is the moment where Pelayo becomes more than a symbol. He becomes an analyst of his captors. And then comes the pressure point the regime cannot fully control: humiliation that touches lineage. Whether it is a forced marriage story, a political arrangement later turned into moral outrage, or a composite legend built out of real practices, the mechanism is historically familiar. Occupying powers do not merely demand taxes. They demand visible submission. They demand signs that the old order is not merely defeated, but absorbed. And nothing signals absorption more effectively than family and marriage, bloodlines stitched into the new regime's fabric. Because blood is the last thing a conquered elite believes is truly theirs. Take a man who has already lost a kingdom, strip him of command, hold him as insurance, then threaten to rewrite his family into your legitimacy structure, and you create a specific kind of reaction. Not negotiation, but rupture. The captive doesn't just fear death, he fears erasure. And erasure is the one thing the hostage system cannot compensate for, because the hostage system only offers survival inside the new reality. If the new reality demands the annihilation of your identity, then survival becomes a slow form of death anyway. This is where rebellion is born in the mind, before it is born in the field. Pelayo's escape, in this framing, is not a romantic dash for freedom. It is a refusal to be used as a symbol. It is a rejection of the role the empire designed for him. The compliant local face that makes conquest look peaceful. He does not flee to the safest place. He does the opposite. He runs toward the worst terrain because the worst terrain is where the empire's management style breaks down. He runs toward the space where a man can exist without being constantly observed, registered, and priced. Asturias is not simply remote. It is administratively hostile. It is the kind of landscape that punishes cavalry and turns garrisons into liabilities. It is wet, steep, and fragmented. Roads are fewer, valleys are narrow, and visibility is unreliable. The empire's strengths, speed, mass, coordination, are harder to deploy there without turning into chaos. And chaos is exactly what an outnumbered rebel needs. Not chaos as mindless disorder, but chaos as a denial of the conqueror's preferred terms. This is the strategic genius that later legend compresses into miracles. Pelayo does not need to defeat an empire in an open battle. He needs to do something smaller and more achievable. He needs to create a place where the empire's power cannot be applied efficiently. He needs to create friction, to make every step cost more than the empire wants to pay. And he needs time to recruit not an army, but a network. Time to scout paths that maps don't show. Time to stockpile basic weapons. Time to build a psychological community around one idea. The new reality is not permanent. That's the part empires rarely understand. Permanence is not a fact. It is a performance. It must be repeated until everyone believes it. A single pocket of refusal threatens the performance, not because it can conquer the empire, but because it demonstrates something terrifying, that the empire's totality has limits. So ask the question in the way the empire refuses to. What does it mean when a conquered elite chooses the mountains over the palace, hunger over safety, uncertainty over managed survival? It means the empire has failed at domestication. And when domestication fails, the only tool left is force, applied in terrain that punishes force. In the next part, we enter that terrain. We step into the gorge, the fog, the cliff, the river, and the cave. And we watch how geography doesn't just shape a battle. It becomes the executioner the empire didn't know it had hired. If you want to keep your intelligence intact, stop repeating the slogan 300 versus 100,000 like it's a math problem. Covadonga isn't a lesson about courage defeating numbers. It's a lesson about terrain turning numbers into a liability, and about how empires, intoxicated by speed, walk into environments that punish the very tools that made them great. Asturias is not the north. It is a different physics. The Picos de Europa are limestone teeth, steep ridges, tight gorges, sudden drops, and weather that behaves like a living thing. Fog doesn't just reduce visibility, it destroys coordination. Rain doesn't just soak clothes, it rots morale. Narrow passes don't just slow movement, they rewrite what an army even is. In open country, an army is a machine, cavalry mass, archery arcs, formations that can breathe. In a gorge, an army becomes a queue, and queues are killable. This is the first horrifying truth Covadonga exposes. Geography can commit violence without looking violent. It makes death feel like natural consequence. The victors later call it providence. The losers call it bad luck. But what it actually is a system, a set of constraints that turn human bodies into clogged material. A cave matters in this kind of landscape, not because it is mystical, but because it is positional. The mouth of a cave on a cliff above a narrow valley is a gate that can be defended by very few people. It forces an attacker into a funnel. And funnels do one thing perfectly. They turn big forces into small contact surfaces. Only the front ranks can fight. Everyone behind them is just weight, pressure, panic, and fuel for a crush. That's why the Empire's supposed advantage become poison. Large forces require space to deploy. They require flank routes. They require room to retreat. They require clean lines of command. A narrow gorge offers none of that. In a confined valley, even a disciplined army starts to behave like a crowd, because the geometry of the space doesn't allow discipline to function. Now add what the Umayyad machine is famous for: cavalry mobility and ranged power. In flatland, those are decisive. In a jagged gorge, horses become fragile liabilities, and archers lose the angles that make archery lethal. Shooting upward into an overhang is not the same as volleying across a field. Even if every arrow flies true, gravity and stone are not negotiable. Misses don't harmlessly vanish into distance. They collide, shatter, and become chaotic. The environment turns skill into risk. This is what it means to say, geography launders violence. It makes killing look like mechanics, not choices. It creates situations where the attacker's men die, not because they are outfought in a fair duel, but because they are trapped in an architecture they don't understand. Later stories will describe miracles, arrows returning, mountains swallowing armies, because humans reach for theology when they can't face the simplicity of it. You marched into a space that turned your strength into suffocation. And this is where Pelayo's genius becomes less romantic and more brutal. He doesn't need to invent new weapons. He needs to weaponize constraints. He needs to do what every successful insurgent does: deny the empire its preferred battlefield. Make the empire fight in a place where it cannot convert its resources into control. Make the empire pay more for every step than it expects. That's the core strategic move. Bait the empire into the gorge. Picture the imperial commander arriving with the mindset of a police action. This is what power looks like when it has won too many times. It assumes compliance is the default setting of the world. It expects a show of force to be enough. It expects the rebel to do the rational thing and surrender. It expects reality to behave. But insurgency isn't a debate. It's a recalculation of reality through pain. When the rebel refuses surrender, the empire escalates the way it always escalates: ranged suppression, then heavy infantry. Standard procedure. The problem is that standard procedure assumes standard terrain. In Covadonga's geometry, the procedure becomes self-harm. Your front line compresses. Your rear keeps pushing. Noise and fog distort orders. Men can't see what's happening ahead, but they can feel the pressure behind. The moment panic enters that kind of confined space, panic doesn't spread, it detonates. And then the second layer of horror arrives: the use of height. In open battle, dropping rocks is a gimmick. In a gorge, it is execution. Falling timber and stone don't care about armor or rank. They don't distinguish between officer and peasant. They crush, scatter, block exits, and multiply terror. Even survivors become trapped behind debris, turning retreat into a stampede. The Empire's advantage, its mass, becomes an engine of self-trampling. Your own men become the force that kills you. This is why the story, even stripped of its exaggerated numbers, remains psychologically true. A smaller force that owns high ground and terrain knowledge can turn a larger force into a disaster, especially if the larger force is arrogant enough to enter the funnel without mapping the consequences. And notice what has happened to moral responsibility in this kind of killing. When men die by crush, ricochet, fall, and stampede, it becomes easier for everyone to pretend it wasn't anyone's fault. The victors can say, "God fought for us." The losers can say, "The land betrayed us." Both answers are comforting because they erase agency. But the agency is right there. The choice to dismiss the North as not worth it. The choice to march in without respect. The choice to turn human beings into animals in your language, and therefore into disposable objects in your planning. Covadonga, then, is not just a battle. It is the moment an empire discovers that contempt has a physical cost. The terrain becomes the auditor. It checks the empire's assumptions and finds them fraudulent. In the next part, the story tightens into its most poisonous scene: a priest sent to negotiate surrender at the mouth of the gorge. Not a warrior, because the empire doesn't only want bodies, it wants consent. And that is where we'll confront the darkest weapon of power, the voice that calls submission wisdom, and collaboration peace. The empire doesn't send a priest because it is merciful. It sends a priest because it is efficient. Violence is expensive. Obedience is cheap. Killing men in a gorge costs arrows, time, and reputational risk. But if a single voice can convince the rebels to step down, kneel, and accept the new order, the empire wins twice. It removes a nuisance, and it converts resistance into a public lesson. proof that even the last holdouts eventually see reason. So picture the scene before the killing begins. The mountains are wet, the air is heavy with fog, and instead of a champion stepping forward, there is a churchman, Oppas, riding out under the authority of the occupying force. In later memory, he becomes a villain, because every resistance story needs a traitor. But the more interesting truth is worse. Oppas is not an exception. He is a type. Conquest survives on types. Oppas represents the class of people who learn to live comfortably inside defeat. Not because they are uniquely evil, but because they understand what power rewards. He is described as a high-ranking figure, a man tied to the old order, a prince of the church, meaning he knows how legitimacy works. He knows that armies conquer land, but institutions conquer minds. He knows that religion, law, and public ritual can make occupation feel like reality, rather than an emergency. That's why his job here is not to threaten Pelayo. His job is to translate the Empire's violence into a moral argument that sounds like common sense. And notice the structure of the argument in the script's dialogue. It is seduction dressed as realism. Look at the map. Look at the cities. Look at the scale. Your kingdom is dead. Everyone else has submitted. What you're doing is irrational. It's an argument that treats surrender as maturity. It offers safety, wealth, and local authority under the new regime. It says, in effect, you can keep your life if you agree to call your chains a partnership. This is how power recruits collaborators. It doesn't always demand enthusiasm. It demands language. It demands that you repeat the new story out loud until the old story becomes embarrassing. Oppas is selling a narrative. Resistance is childish. Submission is wise. And like all good narratives, it comes with a reward structure. If Pelayo accepts, he becomes an authorized local ruler, a managed symbol. His men might eat. They might stop freezing. They might survive. And in exchange, they must do something profoundly political. They must publicly admit that the conquest was legitimate, not merely unstoppable, but right. That's what the Empire really wants at the mouth of the gorge: consent. Or at least the appearance of it. Because the most dangerous thing about a pocket of rebellion isn't the casualties it can inflict. It's the idea it broadcasts. The new order can be refused, and refusal is contagious. If one starving group in the mountains can say no, then other communities, those who surrendered out of fear, out of calculation, out of exhaustion, have to confront an unbearable thought. Maybe they didn't surrender because it was inevitable. Maybe they surrendered because it was convenient. That thought is a threat to every collaborator's self-image. So, the collaborators need Pelayo to be wrong. They need him to lose. Ideally, without a messy battle. Ideally, through reason. So when Pelayo answers, his words are more than defiance. They are a counter-technology of legitimacy. He doesn't respond with numbers. He responds with theology. The mustard seed. The smallest thing that grows into something that cannot be ignored. This is not just a religious flourish. It is a psychological inversion. He is rejecting the Empire's pricing logic. He is saying, you are counting bodies, but you are not counting belief. You are counting territory, but you are not counting stubbornness. You are counting today, but you are not counting the long future. And that is the exact point where the negotiation reveals its true nature. The Empire offered a deal that sounds humane: safety, wealth, governance. But the deal is built on a hidden clause. You must accept the new reality as permanent. You must become part of the machine that teaches others to accept it too. You must turn your survival into propaganda. Pelayo refuses, which means the priest has failed, which means the only option left is the one the Empire always uses when persuasion breaks: force. But the priest's presence matters because it shows you something about the moral architecture of conquest. A conquering regime doesn't only win with swords, it wins with voices that normalize the sword. Oppas is dangerous because he offers surrender as virtue. He offers collaboration as peace. He offers survival as proof of wisdom. And the reason this works so often is because it flatters fear. It lets frightened people call themselves practical rather than terrified. That is complicity at its most seductive. Not, I betrayed my people, but I saved them from pointless death. Not, I served the conqueror, but I preserved stability. Not, I accepted humiliation, but I ensured continuity. But continuity for whom? That's the question the priest never answers. Because the bargain always has winners. The collaborators keep their property. The conquered masses keep their labor, their taxes, their silence. The Empire keeps extraction. Peace becomes the name of a system where violence has simply moved from the battlefield into daily life. So in this gorge, you're watching a battle before the battle, a conflict over definitions. Is surrender prudence or submission? Is resistance courage or suicide? Is collaboration wisdom or self-interest? When Pelayo refuses, he is not only choosing death over safety, he is choosing to keep the conquered from being psychologically annexed. He is choosing to deny the Empire the cheapest victory, the victory where the rebel climbs down willingly and makes the conquest look reasonable. And when the priest rides back to the general and says, essentially, he will not surrender, the moment becomes unavoidable. Now the Empire must prove its claim with blood, which leads to the next, brutal hinge. The Empire's first instinct is to use ranged suppression, arrows, slings, because that's how you make a trapped enemy collapse quickly. But Covadonga isn't a normal siege site. The geometry is wrong. The physics are wrong. The Empire is about to learn, in the most humiliating way possible, that even its missiles can turn against it when it fights in a space built to punish arrogance. So here's the open loop that pulls us into the killing. When persuasion fails and the Empire reaches for force, will its violence actually function in this terrain? Or will the environment turn the Empire's own technique into self-destruction? The first volley is always a ritual. It's the Empire reminding the world what it believes about itself, that it can end disputes by projecting death from a distance. Archers step forward, slingers take position. Officers watch for the familiar collapse, the moment the trapped men break, scatter, and become manageable. This tactic has worked for the conquerors across open fields and city walls. It is a practiced violence, almost bureaucratic in its confidence. Covadonga is where that confidence meets physics. From the valley floor, the cave is not a fortress in the Roman sense. It is an overhang in stone, perched above a narrow throat of land. To fire into it from below, you don't shoot forward, you shoot up. That changes everything. Angles become unforgiving. Misses don't disappear into distance. They strike rock. And in a confined space, packed with men, any projectile that fails to kill the enemy becomes a threat to the people who launched it. The chronicles later call it a miracle, arrows returning to those who shot them. Strip away the theology and the spectacle still stands. A volley into hard stone at steep angles can ricochet, shatter, and rain back down into a compressed front line. Whether that happened exactly as described is less important than what the story is trying to convey. The Empire's familiar tool misfires in unfamiliar terrain, and the first wound is not only physical, it is psychological. Because the Empire's power is not just weapons, it's the belief that its weapons work reliably. When soldiers see their own arrows become chaos above their heads, the mind does something lethal. It hesitates. It searches for an explanation while bodies keep moving forward behind it. The front line tries to shield itself, to adjust, to step back. But the gorge is narrow. The rear ranks, unable to see what's happening ahead, keep pressing forward, as rear ranks always do. That pressure compresses the line, turning men into packed material. In that instant, discipline becomes less like a formation and more like a jammed mechanism. Everyone is locked in a shared fate, created by space. This is the true anatomy of a kill box. It doesn't require supernatural skill. It requires geometry that denies options. In open ground, mistakes can be corrected with maneuver. In a gorge, mistakes become irreversible because there is nowhere to maneuver. The terrain strips choice from the mass and gives it to the few who know the ridges. And that is when the second layer of the ambush arrives. Not the cave, but the heights. The men in the cave are the bait. They exist to draw the Empire into the throat. The real teeth are above, hidden positions, loose stones, timber piles, hands that have spent days preparing gravity as a weapon. In a normal battle, dropping rocks is a crude tactic. In a narrow valley with packed ranks, it is slaughter disguised as nature. Rock doesn't care about armor. It doesn't care about skill. It doesn't respect rank. It crushes officers and foot soldiers the same way, and then blocks the path, turning retreat into its own death sentence. Imagine what the soldiers experience in that moment. The sound first, a deep crack of stone shifting, timber snapping, the roar of mass moving downhill. Then the sight. Dark shapes falling through fog. Then, impact. Men crushed, horses screaming, bodies collapsing into the space that was already too tight to breathe. And behind them, more men still pushing forward, unaware that the front has turned into a pile. That's the horror the heroic version sanitizes. People love to hear, "The brave few defeated the many." What they don't like to picture is that the many often die without fighting the few at all. They die because they become a crowd trapped in a corridor, while the corridor itself becomes the weapon. They die by pressure, panic, and the loss of exit. This is why numbers become a liability. 10,000 men in 10 meters of width are not 10,000 fighters. They are a mass of flesh that can be crushed, turned, and broken. Only the first line can strike. The rest are not participants. They are momentum. And momentum is useful only when the space allows it. In Covadonga's gorge, momentum becomes self-destruction. Once panic spreads in a confined force, the old Empire's advantage, coordination, collapses. Commands don't travel cleanly. Banners can't be seen through fog and bodies. Officers can't reposition units because units cannot reposition. Horses rear and injure. Men drop shields to climb over debris. The conquerors who have won through order discover, for the first time in this campaign, what disorder does to an army built on confidence. It unravels it like cloth. And this is where the rebel attack matters, not as the primary killing tool, but as the trigger that turns confusion into rout. When Pelayo's men surge, whether from the cave mouth, the trees, the ridges, they are not trying to match the Empire's strength. They are striking at the Empire's nerve, the officers, the standards, the sense that the line is still a line. In confined space, a small shock can cause a big collapse, because there is no room to absorb it. The stories often place the commander at the center, attempting to rally his men. That's plausible, because commanders do try. Pride doesn't vanish easily. But pride doesn't change geometry. A general on a horse in a gorge is not a master of the battlefield. He is a target in a crowd. If he falls, ancient armies often do what ancient armies always do. They interpret it as the world ending. Leadership is not only strategic, it is moral. It is the belief that the situation is still governable. Remove it, and the army becomes a mass seeking escape. And escape is where the gorge finishes the work. Retreat is not a clean reverse. It is a collision with your own rear ranks. It is pushing against men who are still trying to push forward. It is getting trapped behind debris. It is being trampled by your own animals. It is dying not because the enemy's blade finds you, but because your own formation becomes a coffin. This is why Covadonga is remembered as annihilation. Even with smaller, more realistic numbers, the logic stands. Once a large force is broken inside a funnel, losses can become catastrophic. Not because every man is individually outfought, but because the space turns collapse into mass death. So the open loop now is brutal and immediate. If the killbox shattered the expedition's force inside the gorge, what happens to the survivors who escape into unfamiliar mountains? Leaderless, panicked, and hunted by terrain itself. Because in the next part, the story's second battle begins. Not a clash of armies, but a routed column meeting a landscape that does not care whether you are soldier or prey. A rout is not the end of violence. It's the moment violence stops having rules. Inside the gorge, the Umayyad force breaks. Whether by ricochet chaos, falling rock, or the simple physics of compression doesn't matter as much as the result. The formation dissolves into individual fear. And once that happens, the Empire's men do what all men do when the map turns hostile and leadership disappears. They run toward any direction that looks like out. But Asturias is not a place that gives you out. It gives you corridors. The survivors pour east through high passes of the Picos de Europa, desperate to reach flatter ground where horses might function, and where a road might lead back to the administrative comfort of the south. The script names this as a move toward valleys like Liébana. Whether every specific route is perfectly reconstructible or not, the strategic logic is consistent. Get out of the teeth and back to the plains. Get back to the world where the Empire's strengths, mobility, supply, hierarchy can reassert themselves. And that is exactly what the mountains deny. Here is the cruelty of retreat in this terrain. Your options shrink as your panic grows. In a valley path, the column stretches out, visibility is broken, and a small bottleneck becomes a choke point for thousands. Men cannot see what is ahead, but they can hear what is behind. Hooves shouting, bodies pushing. The rear doesn't know the front is trapped. The front doesn't know how far the rear extends. Everyone is moving on rumor and instinct. And in that condition, the environment becomes more lethal than any enemy blade because it does not negotiate. This is why the script's second disaster, the landslide, functions as more than a dramatic flourish. Medieval sources often amplify numbers and frame natural events as divine judgment. Modern historians are rightly skeptical of figures like 63,000 dead. But the underlying event, catastrophic loss during retreat in unstable mountain terrain, belongs to a pattern we see repeatedly across history. Routed forces die in clusters when they're pushed onto bad ground under stress. A landslide doesn't need miracles. It needs saturation, unstable slopes, and vibration. Heavy rain in mountainous limestone regions can loosen ground. Thousands of men and animals moving in panic can concentrate weight and shock along a fragile track. If the path is narrow and cut into a slope above a river, a collapse becomes not just possible but plausible. And when it happens, it doesn't kill like battle. It kills like machinery, fast, indiscriminate, and final. The script paints it as the mountain itself collapsing on the fleeing soldiers near a place like Kosgaya. Again, treat the exactness of the location and the scale cautiously. But don't miss the point. The retreat becomes a disappearance. Survivors don't just limp home with a story. They don't just return with wounds and shame. Many simply fail to return at all. That detail is psychologically decisive, because empires can absorb defeats. Empires lose battles and come back with better maps, bigger budgets, and a harsher doctrine. What empires struggle to process is silence, the administrative nightmare of an expedition that stops existing. No messengers, no coherent survivor accounts, just rumors, scattered stragglers, and an absence that feels like a curse. Silence is expensive. A commander can write a report explaining a defeat. A governor can request reinforcements. A court can spin a setback into propaganda. But when an army vanishes, the state loses not only manpower, it loses information. And information is what lets power act confidently. Without information, every future expedition into Asturias becomes an investment into uncertainty. The empire's cost-benefit logic, the very logic that led it to ignore the North in the first place, now turns against it. The North becomes a line item that cannot be priced. This is how a small resistance pocket can purchase survival without conquering territory. It makes itself too costly to erase. And that cost isn't only measured in bodies, it's measured in reputation. A conquering machine survives because everyone believes it is safe to submit and dangerous to resist. A disaster in the mountains interrupts that belief. Even if the empire still controls most of Iberia, a single region suddenly looks ungovernable. It becomes a place where soldiers die without clear battle, where commanders disappear, where terrain behaves like an enemy. The label cursed is not superstition. It's a psychological defense mechanism. It's a way for a rational military to say, this place is not worth the price. Meanwhile, on the rebel side, the same silence produces the opposite effect. It becomes proof that resistance is not suicide. It becomes proof that the empire can be hurt. And once that proof exists, it changes the emotional economy of the occupied population. Fear remains, but it now has a rival emotion, more dangerous than anger: hope. Hope doesn't make people moral. Hope makes them mobile. It makes them take risks. It makes them imagine alternatives. And alternatives are what empires kill first. So, when the rooted force is swallowed by the mountains, whether by ambush, exposure, landslide, or all of the above, the victory at Covadonga transforms. It stops being a tactical success and becomes a strategic boundary. The empire still holds cities. It still collects taxes. It still rules the plains. But the north is no longer an afterthought. It is a warning label. And warnings travel. Back in the lowlands, governors and administrators wait for reports. They expect a routine outcome: a rebel's head, a quick cleanup, a restored sense of inevitability. Instead, they receive nothing. And then they receive whispers: a massacre in a gorge, soldiers crushed by falling stone, a column buried by the mountain itself. The story grows in the telling, because terror always grows in the telling. But the core doesn't require exaggeration. The expedition did not produce the administrative product it was meant to produce: control. Now the empire faces a choice it hates making: double down, spend more, and risk repeating the same humiliation with higher stakes. Or reclassify the North as a permanent irritant. Raid it occasionally, punish it when convenient, but do not commit to the kind of occupation that would drain men into fog and stone. That is where the miracle of Covadonga actually lives, not in a single arrow or boulder, but in the Empire's decision calculus after the silence. Resistance doesn't need to kill the Empire. It needs to force the Empire to change priorities. And while the big machine recalculates, the small machine of rebellion turns to the next, colder task: removing the local governor who still represents occupation in Asturias. Because one battle doesn't build a kingdom, it only creates a gap, brief, precious, where a kingdom might be born. So here's the open loop that pulls us forward. When the silence reaches the governors in the south, will they interpret Asturias as a wound to cauterize, or as a bad investment to avoid? And if they hesitate, what will Pelayo do with that hesitation before the empire finds its appetite again? After a catastrophe like Covadonga, the most dangerous thing in the world is not the defeated army. It's the vacuum. When imperial force disappears, authority doesn't vanish politely. It flickers. It becomes rumor. It becomes opportunity. And whoever moves fastest inside that vacuum gets to define what reality is before the empire can rewrite the record. That's why Pelayo can't stop at surviving a battle. Survival is not sovereignty. A cave victory is not a state. If he wants the rebellion to become something that can outlive him, he has to remove the last living symbol of Umayyad rule in the north. The provincial governor, who still holds a coastal seat, still collects what taxes can be collected, still serves as the empire's nerve ending in Asturias. The script calls him Manuza, a political governor more than a warrior, seated at Gijon. That characterization matters, even if individual details blur across sources and later retellings, because the type is historically real. Conquest always appoints local administrators to stabilize newly acquired territory, especially in regions where permanent military occupation is expensive. A governor like this does not need to win pitched battles. He needs to keep the countryside passive. keep local elites compliant, keep the population convinced that resistance is hopeless. Covadonga breaks that spell. Now imagine what news looks like when it travels out of a gorge. It doesn't arrive as a neat report with casualty figures. It arrives as terrified fragments, men stumbling in, half mad from fog, muttering about arrows that turned back, rocks falling from the sky, an army swallowed. Whether every element is literal or exaggerated doesn't matter. The psychological effect is identical. The governor hears the same core message. The expedition didn't just fail, it didn't return. For a politician-governor, that silence is a dagger. He understands the countryside better than the generals do. He knows that peasants obey not because they love rulers, but because they fear consequences. And he knows what happens when fear evaporates. People stop paying. Local collaborators reconsider. Villages stop informing. Roads become hostile. Conquest begins to starve, not from lack of land, but from lack of compliance. So Menuza's problem is immediate and practical. Gihon may be a port, but a port doesn't defend you if the hills behind it turn into an enemy. A guerrilla force that controls the high ground, controls the approaches, the supply lines, the movement of messengers. A governor sitting in a coastal city can be isolated, bled, and strangled without a formal siege. And in a region like Asturias, where permanent imperial occupation is already costly, the governor cannot count on reinforcements arriving quickly, especially when the last expedition has become a ghost story. That's why flight becomes rational. The script describes Menuza gathering treasure, guards, possibly captives, and running south toward terrain where cavalry and roads restore the Empire's advantage. Again, the precise details may be debated, but the logic is sound. When your legitimacy collapses, you retreat to where the system still works. You run toward the administrative center of gravity. But Pelayo's rebellion, if it is to become permanent, must do something absolutely ruthless. It must not allow the Empire's nerve ending to reconnect. It must make the governor's escape impossible. Not because vengeance feels good, although it does, but because survival requires a hard truth. Most heroic stories soften. A new state is born when the old state's local machinery is physically removed. So the pursuit begins. This is where the story shifts from battle to hunt. And hunts are morally revealing because they strip away ceremony. There are no banners, no formal field, no idea of honorable combat. There is only speed through terrain, knowledge of paths, the ability to intercept. The rebels, light on their feet and native to the valleys, move faster through back routes than a fleeing official burdened with wealth and guards moving along predictable roads. If Menuza is caught, whether in a skirmish, an ambush, or a capture, his death becomes more than personal. It becomes a political decapitation. The Empire can replace a governor, yes, but replacement requires access and confidence. And after Covadonga, confidence is exactly what the Empire has lost in this region. A new governor would need troops, maps, reliable local collaborators, and the willingness to gamble men in fog and cliff. Pelayo understands this, whether consciously as strategy or instinctively as survival. The governor's removal sends a message far louder than any sermon. The Empire's administration is not protected. The North is not merely rebellious, it is uninsurable. Now comes the moment the script emphasizes as coronation. Warriors raising Pelayo on a shield, a raw proclamation, not a cathedral ritual. Even if later tradition stylizes it, the underlying transformation is historically meaningful. Rebel bands become polities when they formalize leadership, define territory, and create continuity beyond the next raid. A crown can be gold, or it can be consensus. The function is the same. It tells everyone watching that this is no longer a temporary tantrum. It is a claim. And claims are dangerous because they demand response. This is where the border is born, not as a line on a map, but as a fact created by cost. The Umayyad state may still be able to strike Asturias, but able to strike is not the same as able to rule. Rule requires predictability, taxes collected, roads passable, governors safe. Covadonga plus the governor's fall creates an environment where rule is expensive and uncertain. Empires don't always retreat because they are defeated militarily. They retreat because the ledger turns red. So the rebellion gains what it needed most: breathing room. Not victory over the caliphate, but time to harden into a kingdom. A name begins to stick. A capital, humble, defensible, becomes a symbol. The north becomes an idea, a place where occupation does not feel permanent. But this is where the story becomes colder, because the moral cost of state building doesn't stop with killing governors. A kingdom born in a cave does not survive by purity. It survives by strategy. And strategy often means doing to others what you fear being done to you. In the next part, we confront the dark template that keeps this tiny kingdom alive. The deliberate creation of emptiness, the weaponization of depopulation, and the invention of a buffer zone that turns human lives into a defensive moat. The question is simple and brutal. When resistance becomes a state, does it stop being a victim? Or does it learn to speak the empire's language with a different accent? A kingdom that survives next to a superpower doesn't survive by bravery. It survives by engineering costs. That is the uncomfortable legacy that grows out of Covadonga. The cave buys time, yes. It buys a psychological shock, yes. But time is not safety unless you turn it into a system. Pelayo's successors inherit a cruel equation. If the Umayyad state ever decides to return with full attention, maps, planning, disciplined mountain columns, Asturias cannot meet that force on open ground. Not once, not ever. The plains are where cavalry rules. The plains are where supply trains can move. The plains are where numbers can finally become numbers again. So the northern strategy does something that sounds defensive, but is actually an act of creation. It builds a border out of nothing. Later tradition calls it the Desert of the Duero, a depopulated buffer zone south of the mountains. Whether the scale and exact chronology are debated by historians doesn't erase the strategic logic behind the concept. Empty land is harder to conquer than inhabited land when the conquering army depends on living off the country. Food, fodder, shelter, information. Those are the real pillars of invasion. Remove them, and even a strong army becomes a starving column. This is the part resistance mythology rarely admits, because it contaminates the purity of the victim narrative. To keep Asturias alive, the northern rulers don't merely defend. They raid, they burn, they relocate people. They prefer emptiness to occupation. They would rather turn a river basin into a wasteland than let it become a staging ground for an imperial march. And that decision is not a footnote. It's the birth of a new kind of power. Think about what buffer zone actually means in human terms. It means villages whose existence is treated as a strategic liability. It means crops that must not be harvested because harvest feeds the wrong army. It means families pushed north, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes forcibly, because a populated frontier is an invitation to conquest. It means the creation of a scar across the map, maintained year after year, because the scar makes invasion expensive. This is how a small kingdom weaponizes logistics, not by meeting the empire's swords, but by attacking the empire's stomach. If an Umayyad commander plans a punitive expedition into Asturias, the decisive question isn't, how many men do we have? It's, where do we feed them? A depopulated strip turns the march into a long, hungry corridor. Armies can carry supplies, but supplies are heavy and finite. The longer the route without forage, the more wagons you need, the more animals you need, the more guards you need, until the expedition becomes a moving warehouse vulnerable to weather and ambush. By the time it reaches the mountains, it arrives exhausted, thin, and angry. Exactly the state an insurgent wants its enemy to be in. So, Asturias survives by making the empire's victories feel like losses. Even if the empire wins a skirmish, it doesn't gain a stable province. It gains a nightmare of provisioning and hostile terrain. The ledger stays red. But here is the moral fracture. Once you adopt this logic, you begin to think like an empire. You begin to treat people as assets, liabilities, and movable parts. The same administrative coldness that once horrified you becomes the price of survival. That's why Covadonga's miracle doesn't end in 722. It mutates into a doctrine, the discipline of making the frontier unprofitable. And behind that frontier, the kingdom hardens, not just militarily, but socially. A society that expects raids builds differently. Churches start looking like fortresses. Communities organize around watchfulness. Law becomes a tool not only for justice, but for cohesion. Rules about land claims, service obligations, oaths, inheritance. Identity becomes sharper because identity is survival. The mountains don't just protect bodies, they protect a story. We are not absorbed, we are not finished. At the same time, the south, Al-Andalus, develops into something the north cannot ignore, a richer, more urban, administratively sophisticated world. That contrast is important because it exposes the psychological engine of long wars. The north defines itself by refusal. The south defines itself by order and prosperity. Each side becomes the other's negative image, and the border becomes a moral theatre where every raid is justified as necessity. This is where complicity becomes generational. People born after 722 will inherit the conflict as normal. They will inherit raids as routine. They will inherit the idea that emptied land is defense. And they will inherit the habit of telling themselves that what they do is different from what the empire did, because they do it for survival, not domination. But the dead don't care about your rhetoric. When you burn someone's crops, they starve whether you call it strategy or terror. When you uproot communities to create a buffer, their lives break, whether you call it migration or cleansing. The North's story is still one of resistance, yes, but it is also the story of how resistance learns to carry a knife without flinching. and that knife creates a future. Over decades, the tiny northern polity becomes more than a refuge. It becomes a magnet. People living under the new southern regime, some content, some resentful, some simply ambitious, move north for opportunity, land, and a different political identity. The north begins to absorb energies, skills, and grievances. The mustard seed stops being a metaphor and starts being a demographic process. Meanwhile, the Umayyad world faces its own fractures. Distance, revolts, court turmoil, the sheer difficulty of governing a vast and diverse empire. This doesn't mean the south is weak. It means it is busy. And busyness is exactly what a small frontier kingdom needs. Not an enemy collapse, but an enemy distracted enough to postpone the expensive problem. So the border holds, not as a moral victory, but as a cost-based equilibrium. The North survives because it makes conquest of the North an unattractive project. It survives because it turns geography into a fortress and emptiness into a moat. It survives by doing something bleakly rational. It refuses to offer the empire anything worth taking. Now we can see the shape of the big question we asked at the beginning. This isn't simply, how did the few beat the many? It's this. When power feels total, what really defeats it? Enemy strength, or the empire's addiction to contempt and low-cost control? The empire laughed at wild donkeys because it mispriced resistance. It treated Asturias as cheap to ignore. That contempt gave the North time to become a system. And that system, in turn, learned to weaponize the very thing empires worship: logistics. In the final part, we resolve the question by looking at what Covadonga becomes in memory, how a tactical mess turns into a national myth, why myths are useful, and what they hide. Because the most powerful empires don't only conquer land, they conquer the story you tell yourself about what happened and who paid for it. Covadonga doesn't end as a battle, it ends as a story. And stories are where power goes when it wants to outlive the bodies. If you strip the event down to what we can responsibly say, you're left with a hard core and a soft halo. The hard core. In the early 8th century, a small Christian-led force in the Asturian mountains resisted Umayyad authority and won a confrontation significant enough to become a foundation myth for the kingdom of Asturias. The soft halo is everything that later generations pour into that hard core. Miraculous ricocheting arrows, impossible numbers, rivers running red for days, mountains collapsing like divine fists, speeches polished into scripture. The halo isn't lies in a simple sense. It's what societies do when they need a past that can justify their future. Because once the cave is remembered as a miracle, it becomes more than an ambush. It becomes permission. Permission to continue. A frontier kingdom surviving next to a stronger power needs more than tactics. It needs endurance. Endurance is not a military resource. It's a psychological one. A population that believes resistance is holy can tolerate hunger longer. A ruler who claims sacred origin can demand harsher sacrifices. A community that treats its origin story as proof of divine favor can endure setbacks without losing the thread. That's why Covadonga becomes a shrine. Not because shrines are harmless, but because shrines are political technology. They compress suffering into meaning, and meaning is what makes long wars possible. The conflict that later gets called the Reconquista isn't a single war. It's a long chain of campaigns, truces, alliances, internal civil wars, and shifting borders, centuries of grinding change. But the myth of Covadonga offers an organizing lie that feels like truth, that there was a single mission, a single direction, a single destiny. It turns messy history into a straight road from a cave in Asturias to the fall of Granada in 1492. That is not how real politics works, but it is how nations learn to tell themselves they were always meant to win. So here is the confrontation that resolves our big question. We asked, in different forms across this script, when power looks total, when it has cities, armies, administrators, priests, taxes, what actually defeats it? Is it bravery? Is it divine intervention? Or is it something uglier? The empire's own addiction to low-cost control, its habit of contempt, its belief that small pockets of refusal are naturally self-erasing. Covadonga's answer is not flattering to anyone. The Umayyad regime in Iberia didn't fail because it lacked strength. It failed in the north because it treated strength as a substitute for attention. It treated Asturias as a minor nuisance, best left to hunger and winter. It tried to administer legitimacy through collaborators and hostages, rather than paying the cost of full control in hostile terrain. It assumed that reality was what the empire declared it to be. That assumption is what cracks. Because reality is not only declared, it is enforced. And enforcement has a price. Asturias raised that price by weaponizing geography, time, and the empire's own logistical expectations. Not by defeating the empire head-on, but by making the act of finishing the job feel like throwing men into a grinder for little reward. So the empire recalculated. It didn't forget Asturias because it was kind. It deprioritized it because the ledger no longer made sense. That is the political psychology of empire in its purest form. It doesn't always lose to the strongest enemy. It loses to the enemy that makes victory too expensive to justify. But the North's victory is not morally clean either, because once resistance becomes survival doctrine, it becomes capable of the same coldness it once condemned. The buffer zones, the raids, the deliberate creation of emptiness, these are not fairy tale tactics. They are statecraft in its rawest form, using human life and human movement as strategic material. Covadonga births a kingdom, and kingdoms do not live on virtue. They live on decisions that create winners and victims. So, the myth performs a second function. It hides the moral cost of survival. It allows later generations to remember only the heroic refusal, not the harsh machinery that followed. That is what all founding myths do. They launder complexity into righteousness. And that laundering becomes historically consequential. Once a Christian polity survives and grows in the North, other identities, ambitions, and political projects start clustering around it. New kingdoms emerge, borders shift, alliances form and break. The centuries unfold. By 1492, Granada falls and Islamic rule in Iberia ends, not as the inevitable fulfillment of a single cave prophecy, but as the outcome of long, uneven history shaped by economics, politics, demography, and countless local choices. And yes, after 1492, Spain's trajectory intersects with Atlantic expansion in ways that reshape the world. But if you want to stay honest, you don't say Covadonga caused everything. You say something colder and truer. Covadonga became one of the stories that made later sacrifices feel justified. And once sacrifices feel justified, states can ask for more of them: money, blood, obedience, without needing to explain the full bill each time. So what does the cave finally teach us? It teaches that power is rarely defeated by a single heroic act. It is defeated when its assumptions break, when the people it tried to manage stop participating in the performance of inevitability, when the empire's tools, numbers, cavalry, intimidation, collaborators, stop producing the outcomes the empire expects. And it teaches that resistance is not automatically virtuous. Resistance is simply what happens when people decide the terms offered by power are worse than the risk of pain. Sometimes that decision creates liberation. Sometimes it creates a new machine with a different flag. The moral question never disappears. It just changes uniforms. So here is the resolved answer to the big question. The empire's total power was never total. It depended on consent, on cost control, on the belief that the conquered would accept the new reality as permanent. Covadonga mattered because it broke that belief, then turned the break into a myth strong enough to survive centuries. Because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak.